The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Oh, my goodness. We have a full house tonight. This is, of course, I'm Brian Brake. Mr. Betcher and Mr. Lynn joining me this evening.
Hello. Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, well, it's been a couple of weeks. I know our podcasters, but they just finished up an extra long section of excellent discussion with Alyssa Miller and April Wright on IoT security and privacy. Before that, we actually did a little bit of open source sustainability and supply chain issues with them. So we appreciate their leadership and time and spending time with us, educating people. And this week is no different. So before we get started, though, anybody been watching the Olympics? Mr. Berlin, Mr. Betcher, you been watching the Olympics at all? You can no, okay, all right.
No, yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I'm gonna bring our guests in because I'm hoping somebody will be watching the Olympics with me. Eric Lankford and Doug Levin.
Levin, correct? Yeah.
Levin. Yes. Whew. All right. I almost got it wrong there, but I pulled it back. Got it right. All right. So yeah, Doug, Eric, you been watching the Olympics at all? You watched any of that?
We watched a little bit of it,
That's
bit
good.
of the, I think we watched some ice skating and then well, we have two boys, so they like all the, the snowboarding, the skiing, the biathlon, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So, yeah. And so we've watched a little bit.
That's cool. Doug?
My wife is a huge skating fan, was actually a competitive skater growing up. So, this is still her passion. So this is one of the big events that comes around every few years. And so, over the moon about Nathan Chen and
nice.
Love watching all the competition.
Yeah. I watched a lot of the slope style stuff, what they consider the newer sports, the half pipe and everything like that. And I noticed, and I mentioned it to my wife more than once. I was like, the difference in how competitors treat one another is completely different than the figure skating or the speed skating folks. I mean, they throw up one of these, Ollie 1080 McTwists with a front side 840 or whatever the hell it is. I don't know, but it sounds incredible, ladies and dudes both doing it. And, they don't land it, but everybody gets out there and they're all like, yeah, man, that was awesome. Yeah. And I see the figure skaters. I'm like, whatever.
They're taking lead pipes to each other's knees.
Right. Well,
they do not like each other.
You had to be there. Yeah. Right. But yeah, I mean, the dynamic between them is completely different. I mean, and you see that in the snowboarding and the skateboarding I saw in the Summer Olympics as well. It's I actually enjoyed that. It seems to be a bit more of a positive environment for, depending, it don't matter. The lines on the map, the countries don't matter. It's like you got out there, you kicked ass, you put up big air, everybody's applauding everybody else. And I actually found myself rooting for, countries that, I wouldn't normally root for. I mean, I was rooting for the U.S. obviously, but the Swiss and Norwegians and they're like, this is the first year they've been out here doing this thing. I'm like, holy shit, get out there, yeah, So it was pretty cool to see those folks. I'm sorry it's over actually, but the Paralympics are coming up, and I'm actually quite interested in seeing that too. It's one of the first times I think that they've actually televised those on national TV. So I'm looking forward to seeing some Paralympic events as well to see how they adapt to sports, or the sports adapt to them in this case. So interested in doing that. So anyway, I'm sorry some of you on the listening to the podcast probably don't care. I just, I'm very interested in that, and I love the camaraderie and the cooperation there. So yeah. Okay. So we've been talking to Doug and Eric here for a few minutes. Doug, introduce yourself, please, and tell us what how you got into the job that you're currently doing, and a little bit of your background. And we'll go with Eric, and then we'll get started.
All right, so let me see if I can cut this to the short version here. But I've spent my career working in like education, research, public policy, with a technology focus since the mid '90s. Since we were trying to connect kids to the information superhighway. I was started my work actually during the Clinton Gore administration. We thought if we could get 4 kids to a computer, that education would be transformed. And we just open up the world. And of course, a lot of things have changed. We met that mark, right? But maybe education hasn't transformed quite in the ways that people predicted way back when. So I've been in a variety of roles over time, working on those issues, watching education and schools take up more technology, studying it, advocating about it. For about 5 years, I served as executive director of an association called SETA, or the State Educational Technology Directors Association. So I work with and advocated for technology leadership in state departments of ed around the country, and did a lot of work in DC around that. And when I left that work, I wanted to sort of take a step back and kind of reevaluate where I wanted to lean in. And I started seeing local news stories of schools being compromised by school cybersecurity incidents. And at one level, I wasn't surprised, because I knew they were using more and more technology, and everybody who's connected to the internet with devices is at risk of this stuff. But when I went looking for information about data and trends on who was attacking schools, how are schools defending themselves, the only things that I found, from the cybersecurity industry, that were talking about the education sector, defined it in a way that didn't make sense to me as somebody who worked in the field, meaning that they almost define the education sector at a meta level. So it's K-12 schools and colleges and universities, they're all considered education. Public and private institutions, they're all education. Training companies, they're education. And it's a global sector. So when Verizon would talk about the attacks in the education sector, go, wow, that's fascinating. And I'm like, but that probably doesn't make sense for the K-12 community, right? Because, higher ed has a lot of valuable IP that it might be involved in a data breach that an elementary school is not going to have, right? So it really, when I couldn't make sense of it, I just started to figure that maybe I should start assembling some data myself, see what I could learn. And I started assembling a database of publicly disclosed school cybersecurity incidents. And when I launched that database in the form of a blog post in March 2017, I did it on the form of a map. There was about 100 incidents that I had identified from 2016 forward. I just arbitrarily started in 2016, about 100 incidents. And, but I kept seeing more and more incidents. And the more that I learned, the more concerned I got. And it got me out speaking and starting to raise awareness about cybersecurity issues in schools. It's a chance where I got to meet other advocates like Eric. And sort of long story short, in working with Eric and other colleagues, and I'll let him pick up the story from here. We partnered together to create an organization to not just sort of document and do research on the challenges facing the sector, but try to do something to help the sector respond to these threats. So my background, I mean, it's funny, I guess, maybe to say in InfoSec, to say that my background is non-traditional, because I think most everybody, I don't know that there's a traditional, but, mine is actually more public policy advocacy. My undergraduate degrees were was in English. Right. I'm certainly more technically savvy than a lot of my peers throughout my career, but I would never, consider myself a technical expert, certainly compared to somebody like Eric, or probably many of you or many of your listeners. But this is something that I'm getting to learn more and more about every day. But there are ways, but I do understand how education works, how decisions get made, how change happens, and how to bring people together. And so that's really been my focus, and it's been in working in partnership with Eric, where we've been able to create this team to create this new organization. So Eric, why don't you go ahead and take the rest of the origin story and your background, fill in the gaps there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Doug. So again, Eric Lankford. So my my path is a little different than Doug. So I am more of a traditional, I guess you could say, maybe security person. I've been doing information security for about 20 years. I started in IT, like a lot of people, just general, and then actually quickly moved into the security side of things. And in about 2015, I did a lot of travel. And so 2015, I decided my kids were getting older. I didn't want to travel anymore. And so I took a job at that time at a small private school, and it was not security related. It was more of an overall IT to help them with their IT infrastructure. And when I walked in there, I just thought, wow, these guys do not think about security. I felt like, honestly, from the companies that I used to work with, I worked in a lot of the, major corporations, pharmaceutical, banking, retail. So, they had pretty mature cybersecurity programs. And when I went into this school, I felt like it went back in time 5 years, maybe more, because they just didn't they didn't think about it. And so at the time I thought, well, let me get them involved in an ISAC or some type of information sharing organization. And so I started looking around, and there wasn't anything out there that was specific to K-12. So I said, okay, well, what can I do? And I was at the private school about 3 years. And during that time, I had reached out to some different people and, just to talk about different things. And then I went to a public school that had about 25,000 students. And it was actually an interesting position because they had actually decided, hey, we are going to hire somebody that is specific to cybersecurity. We want somebody to come in and help us build out a cybersecurity program. So I took that role. And same thing, when I walked in there behind, don't think about things like they should, but at least they were open to that. And then about that time, not too long after I started there, and let me back up a little bit. So I had known about Doug had started his the cyber K-12 cyber incident map. I think, what was that, Doug? 2016, 2017, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So I had known about that and used it as a resource. But when I started at this public school, and I was still working at the time, I had started working with ISAC, and there's an organization called the ISAO Standards Organization. I had been having a lot of conversations with them on, hey, there's a need for a K-12 ISAC. How do we start one? What can we do? So about 2018, I met somebody who was the president of an organization called Global Resilience Federation, which is our parent organization. And so Global Resilience Federation, a little background on them, the way they started is they spun out of Financial Services ISAC. So Financial Services ISAC was one of the original ISACs that were with the original presidential directive that said, hey, we need to stand up ISACs for the 16 critical infrastructure. Financial Services was one of those. They started having other organizations that were not financial services coming to them and saying, hey, can you help? Or first they said, can we join? And of course, the answer is no, you're not financial services. And then they said, well, can you help us start an organization? So they started doing that, started helping other organizations outside of financial create their own information sharing organizations. And so they eventually, it started doing well enough. They said, wait, we need to spin this out. And internally it had been called Sector Services. So then they spun that out into something called Global Resilience Federation. And that's where, when my meeting with, it was a lady named Cindy Donaldson, who was president of Global Resilience Federation. I met her at a conference and I said, hey, Cindy, there's a gap in K-12 and there's a gap in the ISAC and the ISAC organizations, and it's K-12. Nobody's focusing on it. She said, you're right. And so, and actually I had reached out before I think I even met her. I think I'd reached out to Doug and said, hey, Doug, I think there needs to be an organization like this. I know you're working kind of in this space. Let's work. So Doug was involved in some of those initial conversations I think we had with ISAC. And, but anyways, so once we got kind of in touch with Global Resilience Federation, it was nice because they already had a structure and framework in place where we were able just to come, and they're a nonprofit as well. We were able just to kind of come in underneath their umbrella, spin up real quick. We had our, I guess our soft launch was kind of October of 2020. And then January of 2021 is when we had our official launch. But yeah, so that's really the quick and dirty story, but how kind of we came together and realized that, hey, there needs to be an organization that focuses on K-12 specifically for security.
And the crazy thing is that it wasn't until Eric and I worked together and then collaborated with GRF to launch the K12 Security Information Exchange, or K12SIX's. We were the first organization dedicated solely to helping school districts respond to and better manage these risks. To my knowledge, we're still the only only organization that does that. And it's kind of crazy at one level that it took until this long for an organization like ours to launch. But there's a lot of work to be done, and it's just different than I think the needs of other sectors. Right. There's a lot of things about schools that are special, and but one of the challenges is this is not an issue where they've had any history with, right? And I was going to say, even for when Doug and I came in, kind of underneath Global Resilience Federation, we had to talk with them a lot. Hey, look, K-12 is going to be so different than your other sectors. There's a lot of hand-holding we're going to have to do. You can't treat them the same way you treat these other sectors. They're just not even close to the same maturity level. So it's definitely, and I think that's still probably one of the primary issues, is people just don't understand the K-12 sector when it comes to cybersecurity.
Right. Yeah. So in some of the research I was doing on ransomware and EDU stuff, EDU-SEC in this case, and for those of you longtime listeners, this is not the first time we've talked about this. We had April Murdoch, Seattle Public Schools, CISO, and Nathan McNulty on talking about, EduSec, and, because I was shocked to learn about how, and Amanda and Mr. Betcher, of course, were shocked at, the seeming lack of, not, and I'm not saying they're not doing their job. They're doing a great job. It's just, there's a lot of schools out there that can't afford, dedicated security personnel, or, they even contract out their IT stuff. So, April actually told me about Doug and Eric here, and we wanted to reach out and say hello. So one of the things that during my research I found, it's the story from the conversation said from August 14th to September 12th of 2021, education attacks organizations were the target of over 5.8 million malware attacks, or 63% of all such attacks during that time period. 1,681 U.S. schools, colleges, and universities were attacked in 2020, ransomware specifically, and 44% globally of educational institutions were targeted by such attacks. Now, when they say educational institutions, I'm assuming, elementary all the way up to, high school or secondary education or university type levels. But that's a lot of networks and a lot of information that's being gathered or ransomwared, and it seems like there's a soft target here. So when you stood up the K6 or K12SIX's, how did you get buy-in? How did you notify, how does a school in Nebraska, an elementary school in Nebraska, know about you? And how do you get your message out there to say, hey, we're here to help you. We're not here to, because we're technically, and I don't know if you call yourselves an NGO or an extra governmental organization. I mean, who do you report to? But I mean, it's like, there's got to be some orgs out there that would be like, we got ransomware, but we're not telling anybody, or we don't want anybody to know, because that's going to impact our jobs, the community, our school budgets. I mean, how do you build that trust? And then how do you take that information and report it up to whoever it is you report to?
Well, I'll say one thing about information sharing, and then I'll let Doug answer that question. But because what you hit on is a general problem with information sharing across the board in all sectors, not just K-12 and not just K-12, right. But it's that mindset of, why would we want to share something that could be detrimental to us if it became public? And that's where ISACs and other information sharing organizations are critically important, is because it allows you to do that, to share that information with I would say there's always a risk that it could become public, but with a significantly reduced risk that it will ever become public. But you can still work together with those of the like mind in your sector to try and resolve that problem. So I think that's a problem across the board. And as you've probably seen the news stories, about NSA and FBI and these other government organizations saying, hey, we need to do a better job of sharing information with sectors. And so that is an issue and something, but that's exactly why we are there, is to make that process easier and more secure.
Okay. Doug?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as Eric mentioned, the disclosure issue is a rough one, right? And I think it is the case that even of the available research, it's probably understanding quite a large amount how many incidents are happening in schools today. I think and then getting people to this culture of information sharing. I think one of the big emphases in our work is actually helping schools to understand this is not an issue just facing their district or their building or them or the IT director's issue. It's not some personal failing of theirs, but helping them to recognize that these are issues being faced by their peers all across the country. And this is in fact a collective issue. And it's actually gotten to the point now where we've seen some policymakers, both at the state and federal level, we're starting to get the message that it's not just, this school down the street that had an issue, but it is schools all across the country who are experiencing this issue. And maybe we need to mobilize some support to help them. I mean, you asked the question about like, how do we sort of get the word out so people know about us? I mean, it's what shoe leather work. I mean, right. This is where it helps to know the sector, reaching out to people who trust us. You talked about April and Nathan, identifying those champions, right. And empowering them, working with them. We do have a couple of signature initiatives that have helped us get the word out. One is we do an annual report on the state of K-12 cybersecurity based on research that we had been doing. Actually, I had been doing even before we joined K12SIX's on publicly disclosed school cybersecurity incidents. That's now essentially become the definitive source of data on the challenges that school districts are facing and trends. And then just last year, we also put together with maybe about 36 of our members, a document essentially we called our Essential Cybersecurity Protections for Schools. Not a full framework by any means, but a short list of high priority controls that we felt would both benefit every school district for having in place, but also would be reasonable for them to do so, right? And it would it would really protect them against the majority, 60, 70, 80% of the attacks that we end up reading about or hearing about, right? It's the basics, right? But there is no floor on school district cybersecurity practice. There is no law that says school districts must do X, Y, or Z, or they don't get federal money, or you'll get sanctioned by some group. And in fact, there are states that do audits of school districts that include their IT systems. And, getting a bad audit of your IT system, life goes on. There's no consequences to that. And even the states that have kind of leaned in and said to essentially local government agencies across the board, including school districts, you have to do X, Y, and Z. There's very little accountability around that. So, we're trying to do what we can to raise awareness about the challenges that schools are facing, because I think a lot of people don't understand why schools would be targeted. And then also to advocate for a set of baseline controls that we think everybody can have in place that would get a lot of the high frequency stuff that they're facing day in and day out. The mass phishing campaigns, the scanning the internet for, unpatched servers, the things that less mature organizations fall for.
Now, you had mentioned like working with ISACs. Are they able to help out with any of that stuff? Like, or do you work in like coordination with them to like, I don't know how often like a small school district would even know an ISAC is a thing, right? Like, or even that cybersecurity is a thing. I could definitely see like my kid got in trouble as a senior because he printed out a picture to all like 50 printers across the entire school district. I don't know that they know that, and that's kind of the same thing you see with like all small businesses, right? Like they don't even know that cybersecurity is something they should even look into. So yeah, I could definitely see that being one of the bigger challenges.
You're correct about saying, and most schools don't know what an ISAC is, don't think about cybersecurity, and that's true. Most there's a lot of organizations outside of even, I would say a lot of organizations, if they're not one of those 16 deemed 16 critical infrastructure, don't know what an ISAC is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the question I asked earlier was kind of what Ms. Berlin had posted up in our show notes, what are some of the ways to go about addressing that? So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking you have a lot of great information, but if that school doesn't have a good way of taking that information and using it, they're going to miss out on these things. I mean, we talked a little bit before the show. You don't charge a ton of money to be able to join this, and that was one thing we talked about, was the costs and the budget. If they don't have the resources, are there companies that you work with as part of the K6 ISAC thing to say, okay, if you don't have access to cybersecurity people, or even a good IT contracting company that can do this stuff for you, we can contract with I don't know, are there any nationwide IT organizations or type security that could do that at scale? I mean, I'm just thinking about how you might help them with resource issues, or ways that they can, use that information. Cause you could give this information to them all day and they're gonna be like, well, I don't know what to do with this. You've given me a Ferrari, but I don't have any keys, that kind of thing. What happens in that case?
That's a big problem. And so I'll give you two things that we're doing internally. So one is with our analysts. That's where they can, when we talked about the portal that's available, they can submit that information up and have access, our analysts, for them to look at it and review it and contact them back. That's one way. The other is something that we are doing, is we're calling it virtual office hours or virtual CISO sessions. And basically, and so right now that's every Monday at 12 noon. If you're a member, I run those, and if the link's on the calendar in the portal, if there's no topic, there's no agenda, it's just there. If somebody has something, like you mentioned, like say, hey, they get these, and I'll give you an example. So, and this was actually just this past Monday, we had I had a teacher sign up. She actually contacted me. It was she had been on a webinar we did, and the virtual CISO sessions got mentioned. And so she said, well, I want to do one of those. So she contacted me, and this was a school that was probably, I think she said they had about 30 students, typically, maybe a little more sometimes. She was the IT person, a teacher, and she had one other role, I don't remember. And the main reason, and this happens in a lot of cases, the reason she was an IT person was because she kind of knew more than anybody else. And so what happens is, so she's been dedicated, the person that does everything. And even if you look at, so if I gave our essential protections to anybody in the cybersecurity world, they would look at them and go, this is way too simple. This is not going to work for most people. It's very good. It's easy to read, but you need more. But then if those same essentials, working with a teacher like this or a person like this that had those multiple roles, there were so many questions around each one. Well, how do I do this? What does this mean? And so that is the thing that we have to understand, that is so different about most schools, is that's where most of them are. And talking about the essential protections, I mentioned a single sheet. We have a one-page document. And when we with our members developed this, that was the one big thing we wanted, is a single sheet that we could give to non-IT people, non-security people, superintendents, school board members, administrative officials, that they could look at it and go, oh, I get it. I understand we need to be at least doing these things. So as simple as it is on those, there's still a lot of things that people don't understand about how they would implement those.
Right.
I also think that people are looking for shortcuts, right?
Well, yes, I'll
right?
agree with that.
Because and it's a little bit of a challenge. And you mentioned sort of working with companies to help school districts, and we absolutely do. We're interested, and we need to work with anybody who is willing to sort of dedicate some energy to uplifting the K-12 sector, right? But a lot of the solutions that folks may rely on in their enterprise organizations, they require dedicated staff to get trained on them, to monitor them, to tune them, to take action when they see things. And that most schools, the vast majority of schools, are not in a place where they're going to be able to benefit from those sorts of tools. Unfortunately, I think as people are getting a little bit more aware of this issue and getting scared, they are looking for those quick wins. And they're working in some respects for those silver bullet solutions. And the marketing on some of these solutions it's quite good, right? There's one thing, protect you from phishing and ransomware, and you do your backups, and we'll, no denial of service. And I'm like, I don't think that your firewall does all those things, but schools are not sophisticated buyers per se. So, a lot of what we're doing is trying to educate people. I think at the end of the day, though, you got to do the work, right? This is as much a technology issue as it is a people and a process and a policy issue. And I think we're also just trying to help schools recognize that this is not something they themselves have to take complete ownership over, but like by working together. You mentioned sort of like, were there companies or organizations that could help? And I think ultimately we're going to need some solutions that are from outside schools that are helping, right? Whether they're regional education agencies, they're different, they call it by different things in different parts of the country, BOCES, ESCs, ESDs, what have you, or private organizations. It could be working at the state level or even national organizations, right? But they're going to have to be places that schools can turn to that are that they can trust, that are vendor neutral, that can meet them where they are and dramatically, sort of help them take those next steps. And that's really what we are, focused on doing. It's just, it's tough right now because I think, people are feeling under assault. They feel the need to do something. And what is that? The old saying, like, nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. Well, if you deploy a new, antivirus, people are going to think you're doing something, even if that's actually not the weakness in your system that you think it is. And if you just spent your energy on a different kind of control, like, I don't know, MFA implementation, you actually might make a much bigger difference to the threat profile of your organization.
Right. And you were talking about this at the, managing this at a state or a federal level. You got 50 states and territories, and you probably have 500 different, ways of doing things. Some state will, buy the same technology for every, school system. So everybody has to use Cisco because that's the state's contract, technology contract vendor, or, then you have the states that don't have anything, and it's like, well, we'll just do whatever we want, and it's different in every specific school system. So there's definitely technological challenges, and then we talked a little bit about this beforehand. You had mentioned the technology stacks haven't changed much in about 20 years. And you've got, technology like Cold Fusion that's super out of date, or using Flash still on some learning management systems. There's a lot of trouble out there. And April had mentioned to us that, you're not only are you under attack with, from external forces, but, kids are probably some of the best hackers in the world, as Miss Berlin has so eloquently mentioned earlier, by somebody sending something out to all of the network printers in the school system. But, that's neither here nor there. I'm sure he'll, once he gets out of prison, he'll have some street cred being a, I'm just kidding, Miss Brian. But one of the things that when I was talking to April initially, she was like, "Oh yeah, go check this out," and it was the self-assessment that you have on your website for various things, and it's somewhat vendor agnostic. There's how many questions are there? There are 10, 11 questions, 12 questions, and are you ready to generate your self-assessment report? Yeah. I actually liked it because, this is definitely something any IT or security consulting firm could give to a customer that, do you have, web-based malware filtering? Yes, we do this, or no, we don't do this, or, and based on these things, you decide whether or not, your systems are a hot mess or you're actually doing fairly decently. And I liked it because it's fairly vendor agnostic. They talk about things like, are you, able to download potentially malicious Office suite, stuff with macros, which is something I want to bring up a little bit later. But I love this and the report, and I apologize. I have run through this a couple of times, so I may be skewing your numbers if you're looking at this. Oh my God, how does this school even work? They've got nothing. Well, that was me, probably, my bad. But yeah, I just like the format and being able to use this to go, hey, we're not doing so well. We probably need to go and, get, block internet downloaded, items, or, maybe we need to implement some, ACLs on the firewall. Nobody from China needs to be able to access anything inside of our network on a portal, or, anybody from Russia, or, anybody not outside 100-mile radius of our school probably needs to even visit our school, our school website or whatever. I'm not saying that's a good security control, but it's something you could say, hey, maybe we need to put in some security control. So I do like this list, and I think it's quite useful.
Yeah, and I would say there are some mentions of vendor specific products in there. I think that's frankly, it's our focus in being pragmatic. Right. There are the tech stack is different depending on where you are. You're right. I mean, it's state differences, regional differences. Like anywhere in IT, you also have people who are really captured by one big vendor or another, have very strong feelings about it. But at the end of the day, most, the vast majority of school districts are running some Microsoft in their stack. Right. A lot of them are running Google in their stack, right? They all have a learning management system. They help, so some of those questions that you see mentioning sample products on are just frankly a reflection of the market share that those companies have in education. And, when that market share changes, we're happy to change. Adjust our questions. It's not that there's a product placement in that list. That's just a way of trying to be pragmatic and actionable for folks with the most likely things you're going to be seeing if you just walked into any district IT closet.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And you mentioned like Windows Defender, but those things that's built in on most Windows boxes, et cetera. So, I mean, yeah, I saw Chrome OS on there. So when they came, did they reach out to you, or did you reach out to them? How does affiliates work in that respect? Sure.
Yeah. Just to be clear. So we're not a reseller of their products, and they're not, like the school districts don't come to us to get to those products. Right. So that's a sort of a traditional sponsorship model. Right. And so they're helping to underwrite our operations. In exchange, we're giving them some marketing opportunities. Sure. Right. But we're not, we are agnostic in terms of who we work with. We don't have exclusives with anybody. But these are some of the companies, some of whom are K12 specific with their solutions. Mm-hmm. Others serve other sectors as well, but are looking to get into K12 more. So we had as Eric I mentioned, we only launched in late 2020. So, really it's been in the last year that we've grown to be of sufficient size and have critical mass to actually get interest from, organizations who are trying to serve the sector. It's just one of the sort of indicators of growth of the community, which is, we've gotten, our community is growing rapidly. We're serving schools all across the country. And it's gotten to the point now where vendors are willing to support our work to show that they're good actors, and also to make sure that people who are interested in K-12 IT security know who they are and are familiar with their solutions. And if it makes sense, they can, develop those relationships independently of us.
Okay.
Yeah. And
All right.
one thing I would like to mention on that is what I would love to see happen is you're probably familiar with Let's Encrypt and ISRG, and the way that companies have sponsored them to say, look, here is a problem that we need to fix. We are going to sponsor you so that we can fix that problem. I would love for organizations to come to us the same way and go, look, K-12 is a problem. Doug has the best quote on it. He says, it's a wicked problem. And so I would love for companies to come to us and say, look, there's a problem and we need help fixing it. And we would love for you to come sponsor so that we can provide these resources to every school across the nation.
And that was all for this week. We'll have part 2 with Doug and Eric next week. I'd like to thank everybody for listening to the podcast and their patronage. Thank everybody who donates to our tip jar every month or every week. Helps us with hosting costs, Zoom payments, Libsyn, domain registration, and just, the time and effort needed to put out a weekly podcast and to create a community and generate, content for that community. So we appreciate it. You can follow Doug and Eric's organization at K12SIX's on Twitter. That's K as in kilo, 12, the number 12, and 6 is SIX, so Security Information Exchange, SIX, like the number 6, but phonetic, SIX. You can also just, click on the link in the show notes. Miss Berlin can be found at InfoSystir, INFOSYSTIR, Mr. Betcher at Betcherpwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. The podcast's official Twitter is at Breaksec, BRAKESEC, and you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. Hope you have a great week. Be kind to one another. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe, and as we say, take care of yourselves because you're the only you have. And we'll talk to you again soon.